Welcome to episode 2 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on February 8th, 2019. Today, I'd like to talk to you some about the preliminary swatch for the Master Knitter program and some thoughts that it made me think. I'll also talk about a few things that have been on and then off my needles in the time since I last spoke to you, and hopefully get some advice from those of you who have gone before. And I have a book review for you. That plus some music to knit by is all heading your way. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That's Ann with an E at familypodcasts.com. The show notes are available at ithoughtiknewhow.familypodcasts.com. And you can find the show on various social media platforms, including Instagram and Ravelry, as I Thought I Knew How. I want to start today by talking in a bit more detail about the preliminary swatch. You might be thinking, Anne, you talked about the preliminary swatch in the last podcast that came out 2 weeks ago. And yeah, I totally did. And I have only just finished dealing with it because I finished it and blocked it and then went into a panic spiral followed by denial about the dang thing. The thing about the Master Knitter program is that it is very easy to start off and feel like you are totally on your own. One of the aspects of the program is that it's largely self-taught. They give you questions and tasks and a writing assignment and then send you off to find the information you need. You do all those things and document where you found the information you needed and send it in, hoping that you did it well enough to be approved. And that's the part that was making me nuts. I could not get past the thought that maybe what I was doing wasn't going to be good enough to impress the judges. Because here's what happened with the preliminary swatch. As a reminder, you do this swatch as your starting point. You knit with the same yarn on 3 differently sized needles in the same swatch, and then you analyze the swatch for proper gauge and drape and your knitting techniques. And you're not expected to be perfect with this swatch. It's your starting point before you start applying what you've learned to the other swatches. Well, first of all, I knit it twice because I could not get gauge the first time I tried. I'm knitting with Cascade 220 and I'm a relatively tight knitter. I should have known to go up a size, but I didn't. And even my largest needle size on the first swatch was not loose enough for gauge. With that first attempt, I was also rowing out very noticeably, meaning my purl rows were noticeably looser than my knit rows. This is a common problem. The way the purl stitch is typically formed in English style knitting uses slightly more yarn than the knit stitch. So if you don't do something to counteract this tendency, you end up with every other row of your stockinette stitch looking slightly larger. Incidentally, if any of you weren't aware of this, now that you know, you're going to notice it everywhere. You'll see it in pattern pictures and store samples, and I apologize for drawing your attention to it. Since I had to reknit the swatch anyway in an attempt to get gauge, I decided to go ahead and research the ways to fix this issue before I started again. And of the 3 or 4 options, I decided to just make a conscious effort to knit my purl stitches tighter. In the end, I found that if I knit my knit rows comfortably and my purl rows tighter than what felt right, I produced a much more even fabric. Wonderful. One lesson learned. I finished the swatch, was able to achieve an appropriate gauge, and didn't notice any rowing out once it had been blocked. My office is a multi-use space for me. It's my work office, my homeschooling space, and my craft room, and it's really not a very big room to start with. So while the preliminary swatch was blocking, I had to move it with the blocking board off the main central table to a smaller side table to make room when the kids came in the following morning for their lessons. And in a classic case of out of sight, out of mind, the blocking board and swatch just sort of lived there for a week or so. Then one day I was sitting in my office chair and I looked over at the swatch sitting on the blocking board, and from across the room and from the lower position of sitting in the chair, I could tell that there was some rowing out. I went over and looked at the swatch from above and the stitches looked fine. But if I got down and looked at it at an angle, it was clear that some areas of the purl rows were larger than the knit rows. And that's when I just completely shut down. All the progress on the project stopped for real. Now, I will say in my defense that my husband was out of town and being the only parent in the home was wearing on me. I'm not comparing my situation to that of a single parent. I would never make that comparison or claim. I was raised by a single mother, and I know from experience how emotionally and physically draining that can be. But I was dealing with a lot more chores and running around and was the only adult in the house bearing the weight of the emotions of 2 teenage girls. And those tiny stitches of ununiform size just were not something I could deal with. My husband got back from his work trip and I went to work playing catch up and got far enough down on my to-do list that deal with the preliminary swatch was the last thing to tackle. But in the meantime, I had really worked myself into an inner tizzy about perfection and what level of perfection would be required to have my work approved by the judges. And I knew I was to the point where I needed to reach out to someone somewhere and get some feedback. What I ended up doing was I logged into Ravelry and found someone who is officially involved in the master knitting program who agreed to take some look at some photos of my swatch and tell me if I was being paranoid or justified in my worry. Because I was so worried that I would move forward and all my swatches would need to be redone if I hadn't attained total perfection with my stockinette stitch. She and I emailed back and forth a few times. She very kindly reassured me and offered a few tips, and I came back at her very kind reassurance with more worries about more minor imperfections that I was sure was going to result in a rejection if I repeated it in another swatch. And I was just clinging to my worry about not being completely perfect. And then she wrote back again and said, "No one is expecting your work to look like it came off a knitting machine." And that is when I finally stopped and took a deep breath and realized I am not a machine. And other people know that. I am not perfect. I can be really good a lot of the time, and I can have times when I do everything right, but I am not perfect all the time. Not even close. I'm going to soak in that realization again for a few minutes while we listen to the song Yippee by Loyalty Freak Music, available on the Free Music Archive. letting go of fear has been an ongoing lesson for me over the last month or so. There have been a lot of situations in my personal life that have been teaching me this lesson, and I don't want to get into those because they aren't wholly my story to tell. But suffice it to say, there have been some growth opportunities in this area, and sometimes I rise to them and sometimes they bowl me over. But I've been doing my best to get up and brush myself down and wait for the next wave. And there have been other things that are more personal, like, say, being a 42-year-old woman with gray in my hair and the beginning of a turkey neck who wants to post pictures of her finished knitting on Instagram. That little fear voice tells me not to because I'll be judged by strangers for the sin of having gray in my hair and the beginning of a turkey neck. Do I really want to expose myself to trolls? And there have been interactions with people that I've been tasked to lead where I mess up. In some cases, impressively so. Have you ever had a relationship with someone where anytime you interact with that person, you make a mistake of some kind? And you get to the point where you just know that the person thinks you're an idiot. I have some of that going on right now. I am a fairly competent person until this one person shows up on the scene, and then I know I'm going to make a mistake somehow within their sight. Whether this is self-fulfilling prophecy or what, I do not know, but I know this person has a very different view of me than most other people because of it. And of course, as a parent, your children eventually get to the point where their issues are more complicated and they have enough world experience to see that you are not right all the time. So what do? You can't sideline your life. I mean, you can, but what a waste. The temptation may be there to withdraw from social media or social situations because you have gray in your hair and the start of a turkey neck, or to avoid the person who you always mess up in front of, to pass the buck to a co-parent when you mess up with a kid, or to just pull back as a parent and count the days until they leave. But in all these so-called solutions, I would just be stunting the potential progress that could be made. We are not machines. We are not going to be perfect. And that's okay. Because other people know you are not a machine. And often they are more forgiving of that fact than we are of ourselves. Don't let the fear voice in your head drown out the voices of those around you who encourage your passions, who look past the grays, who remind you that your best informed efforts are enough, and who trust you to learn when you make a mistake. Being human absolves us from having to be perfect, for we are not machines. That's what I've been learning over the last few weeks. I'd love to hear what you've been learning about, either in your knitting or in your life. Send me an email at ann@familypodcasts.com. That's Ann with an E at familypodcasts.com. And let's learn from each other. This week's sponsor is ButcherBox. And apologies to those of you who are vegans or vegetarians. You may want to skip ahead about 30 seconds. My family and I went on a way of eating a couple of years ago that encouraged you to eat food as close to nature as you can, which meant seeking out a source of grass-fed beef. At the time, we were living in the Philippines, and the only source we could find for grass-fed beef was stringy and gamey and way overpriced. Even after we returned to the U.S., we found it difficult to find quality meats in our area. ButcherBox beef is delicious and affordable and comes right to our door in a special box with dry ice to make sure that the meat stays cold. Aside from beef, they have heritage breed pork and organic chicken. You can choose from 2 sizes of boxes and decide to either get what they send or specify the cuts and types of meat you'd like. We've had nothing but positive experiences with their customer service and their meats. Give them a try using our link, bit.ly/itikbutcher, and you'll get some bonus cuts and a discount off your first box. That's bit.ly/itikbutcher for great meat that won't break the bank. We love them in our household, or I would not be recommending them. bit.ly/itikbutcher. I have been plowing through projects since our last episode. As I said, my husband was out of town, so I was filling in on a lot of the transporting of children to various activities, which meant I had a lot of time sitting and waiting in the car to knit things. Plus, we had some cancellations due to another snowstorm, so I had a few extra nights in. I'm not going to lie, as someone who leans toward introversion, it was pretty nice to be able to stay in and knit while binging a few series on Netflix. If you'd like to see photos of any of the projects I'm about to talk about, they are up on Ravelry and Instagram under I Thought I Knew How, or you can find them in the show notes at ithoughtIknewhow.familypodcasts.com. First, I finished my Loving Embrace shawl that I knit out of lace weight Madeline Tosh. It has become my favorite shawl because between the maroon and the gray, it goes with most of my clothing. And despite a few bitterly cold days, this winter hasn't really been too cold. So most days when I go out, I can just throw this thing around my neck and head out the door. I totally caught up on my Jimmy Beans Beanie Bag Club projects from 2018. Jimmy Beans has actually discontinued the beanie bag for 2019 to go to a larger knit club monthly mailing. And sadly, that meant I had to stop for this year with the typical projects I work on and want to get to and the master knitting projects that I need to do. It just didn't make sense to continue with the projects from Jimmy Beans this year, but I do love them. And I look forward to joining the service again when I finish level 1. They really are a great way to be able to test out different yarns that maybe you wouldn't buy without the chance to try them out. Plus, they often are projects that are the sort of thing that I would see someone else make, or I would see in a magazine or on a website and think, that's really cute, and then not make it myself. Because I just have so many other things that I want to do. But the other thing I liked about them is they often incorporated techniques that I would sometimes avoid, like doing a twisted stitch rib around a hat or doing 3-dimensional knitting, which I'm not completely a fan of. I'd rather crochet if I'm going to do some sculpting with yarn. The first set of kits that I had put on the back burner actually involved sculpting with yarn. So when I got the first of them and opened the kit and saw that it was a kit to knit some 3-dimensional cacti, I said, well, I will be knitting these for my youngest daughter who loves succulents someday. And I stuck it on my craft shelf and let the boxes stack up as they came in and just let them sit there. Once I pulled them out, though, they were really quick knits. I think they averaged about 2 hours apiece. One was a barrel cactus with a pink flower, and there's a swallow and another cactus with yellow flowers. They came out really cute, and my daughter really dug them, so they're living in her room now on a little table. You actually started out by knitting a ball to fill with stuffing, and then you attached the cactus pieces to the top of that and knit flowers to go on, or the swallow came with colored pins you could stick in it. And then the final cactus had a little ladybug that you could put on it. They actually were really cute once they were finished. They had little pots, ceramic pots that you just set them in, and they just look like little succulents. They're very, very cute. The other beanie bag project that I'd put on the back burner as soon as it came in was not because I had anything against the project. I was just really busy with my Christmas knitting. Was a slouchy hat pattern called the Grosgrain Hat by Rachel Rodin. It came in 3 sizes, and I did measure my head because I have a large head and I wanted to make sure I knit the right size. But I ended up falling between the large and extra large options, and I opted to do the large, and I really should have done the extra large because it fits me like a normal hat rather than a slouchy hat. Like I said, I have a big noggin, but despite the snugger than intended fit, I do love how it turned out. And I don't wear hats a lot, but I've pulled this one out 2 or 3 times already to wear, and I only finished it about a week ago. Additionally, I finished 2 cowls made out of the same yarn, which was a 50-50 mohair and wool blend from Persimmon Tree Farm that I picked up at the Sheep and Wool Festival in Rhinebeck, New York a few years ago, and that I had no idea at the time what I was going to do with. It was dyed a lovely pattern of mossy greens that melt almost to a goldenrod yellow before turning back toward green again. And I don't know why, but I loved it immediately, which was so strange because it's sort of outside the usual color palette that I tend to work with. But it was so appealing that I went ahead and picked it up. That said, when I got it home, it ended up a decoration for a long time. I stuck it in an old, cleaned out Yankee Candle jar and put it on my crafting shelves. But January is the month where I finish things, either projects I started and abandoned or yarns I bought and never used. So I decided that I needed to figure this yarn out once and for all. And I ended up on one of the girlfriend cowl patterns by Church Mouse Yarns. The tweed stitch version allowed the color variations to intermingle even more, and the result reminds me of the green of the forest just as the new leaves begin to emerge in the spring, and the branches of the different trees with their varying shades of new leaves are all intermingled in the canopy above you, and it has also become a new favorite. Just in time, because I visited my hairdresser the other day and she cut my hair a full 2 inches shorter than I asked for, so my neck is cold. Let's take a break for a minute and pick up our needles. Maybe you can work on something to keep your own neck warm as we move through these final few months of winter. Let's stick with the upbeat music today. Here's one called Fireworks by Jazar, available at the Free Music Archive. A few more things before I go. First, I'd like to tell you about this book that I read as I did some prep work for the paper on blocking for the Master Knitting program. It's called The Knitter's Book of Wool, The Ultimate Guide to Understanding, Using, and Loving This Most Fabulous Fiber by Clara Parks, who is the force behind knittersreview.com. I borrowed the book from the library, but as soon as I finished it, I hopped onto Amazon and bought myself a Kindle copy. It is so insightful in ways I hadn't even been curious about before. She gives advice on how to understand how wool will behave in your finished project based on how it behaves in the skein. And I've always been a bit of a purist when it comes to yarn. I prefer my cottons to be cottons and my wools to be wools. And sometimes I will allow for some blends if they are in the same family, like animal fibers with animal fibers and plant fibers with plants. And sometimes I will opt for something with a little man-made fiber in it if I'm making something for a non-knitter and want it to survive a washing machine. Her chapter on blending wool with other fibers had me hanging my head in shame for being such a purist. There are absolutely valid reasons for blending fibers with wool, and understanding why can have a big impact on the life and usability of our projects. But the real clincher for me was Chapter 3, where Ms. Parks goes into detail about specific breeds one by one and talks about the characteristics of their wool, the benefits of that type of wool in certain situations, and other interesting tidbits. The vast majority of wool in the market is either merino or blends of different breeds. It's difficult to find some of these breeds spun up on their own, but my curiosity has been piqued, and I'm on the hunt for single breed sources of yarn. And nerd that I am, I hope to take the book with me to the regional fair next year to link the information in the book to the living breed in person. You know, as far as the Master Knitting program was concerned, there wasn't a whole lot in the book that I could use for my blocking paper, but it was just a fascinating, interesting read. So I highly recommend it. As I said, I found a copy of the book at our local library, but I loved it so much I bought my own copy online. I'll throw a link in the show notes at ithoughtiknewhow.familypodcasts.com/episode 2. Check it out and let me know how you like it. I would like to ask you a favor before I go. I am already starting to look ahead to level 2 of the Master Knitting program, and one of the projects for that level is to knit an argyle sock. Now, I have never knit a sock before. I feel like I should be hanging my head in shame for admitting that to everyone, because everyone knows today's knitter loves knitting socks. But as I said, I believe in the last podcast, my mother was the avid sock knitter, and she knit so many that I never really had a need to knit any for myself. The one time I did try to knit some socks, I was so tense because I was traveling alone with my then preschool age daughters in airports that we hadn't been to before, that I made the stitches so tight that when we got home, I couldn't even get the needles back into the stitches again. It was a little crazy. So I gave up and pulled it out and said, sock knitting's not for me. However, I would like to pick this up and start working on the basics of sock knitting before I start the level 2 program. Today, I was over at Margie's Yarn Crafts and picked up enough yarn to make 2 pairs of socks. But when I search for sock patterns, there are a million out there to choose from, and I do not even know where to begin. So if you have a pattern that you love to recommend to sock newbies, I would love it if you would point me in the right direction. Send me an email to ann@familypodcast.com, and I will appreciate you forever. Thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you would like to contact me, you can email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That is Ann with an E at familypodcasts.com. I'm on Ravelry and Instagram as I Thought I Knew How. You may find me on other social media platforms under that name, but those are just placeholder accounts for now. We do have a website for the show at ithoughtiknewhow.familypodcasts.com. There you will find the show notes for each episode, including links to products I've mentioned and ways to support the show. Remember, you can help support the show by ordering from ButcherBox using our link bit.ly/itikbutcher. Thank you for your support. Even if you can't donate financially to the running of the show, it really does help to review us on iTunes and recommend us to your friends. If you see our posts on social media, please feel free to share them. Thank you for your support. If you are a musician or know one and would like to have a song featured on the program, drop me an email and point me to where I can hear your music. You do need to be the copyright holder to be able to grant permission, so please keep that in mind. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.